Welcome back to our series on tarping. Generally, if you have a load that takes more than one tarp, if it's long enough that you're going to need two tarps to cover it, you're going to want to start with the rear tarp first so that they overlap properly and the front tarp is over the top of the rear one for airflow. If you make that mistake, you'll probably only make it once. And as you have more or less overlap, then you have to be careful about that rear tarp coming out from underneath the top tarp, the front one, so that you might need some extra securement in that area. So we're here at the back of this load, and most of our tarps, the most common way that our drivers fold them up is they fold the edges to the middle and the edges to the middle, and then they flop it over. So that means that one edge of this roll is the center of the tarp. So it's helpful if you have a load that's flat on top to pre-stage the tarp so that once you fold it out, it's already pretty well centered side to side. So I can tell by the way this tarp is folded, I can see the outsides of that last fold, and I can see where the last fold was made here. So I want to stage this tarp that way because I know that this is the center of the tarp. So if you start with it offset like this, it's going to be already pre-centered for you. And then generally you want to start with the edge of the flap right at the end of the load. If the tarp is rolled up correctly, this is going to be the end of the tarp that has the end flap to cover the end of the load. So that should be right there, and we want to be able to roll it out and then slide it into position so we get our spacing just right. Okay, so we're up on top of the load now, and one of the things you want to think about is how are you going to get your tarps on top of the load. Most shippers, once they're done loading your load, they'll either put the tarp on top of the load for you, or they'll bring you like the last lift of the load and let you put your tarps on top of that, and then it gets up on top. But you do want to consider when you're on a shipment, how am I going to get my tarps up on the load? Can I get them up there myself? Don't lift tarps if there's a machine available to do it. Like, there's no sense risking extra risk for injury by lifting tarps. So once we're up here and we've got ourselves safely up here, so I'm in a spot where I don't have any fall protection available to me, so I got to be really extra careful about my own safety. And that means looking where I'm going, and I'm also going to survey the top of my load. Like, this load's got a couple of different levels to it, and it's got a skinny spot up there where I could easily fall off the edge of the load. So take a second to survey the top of your load, figure out what you've got for safety, and then keep that mental picture in mind. So we're ready to spread this tarp out now. I'm going to unfasten the bungee that's around it. This one happened to be rolled up with one bungee. I prefer to have two, but we'll come back to that later on. And as we roll it open, if this has been rolled up the easy way, the last person that rolled it up folded the tarp almost in half before they rolled it up. So you don't have to roll very much before you get a hold of this, and then you can just take a hold of this and walk away. Again, watch where you're going so that you don't step on a hazard and go off the edge of the load. So now I've got it folded out to that point where it was folded in, and so I know that this is the center of the tarp. So we want that to kind of match up with the center of our load. If we're all good there, then it's time to go ahead and flop it open. For your own convenience, you want to spend some time getting this tarp centered side to side while you're still up on top of the load. It's a whole lot easier to do it from up here than it is down on the ground. So take some time while you're down there. You can fix about half or 2/3 of the tarp from the other end, and then come back here and fix this if needed. But you can also fix this as you pull the tarp into position. So that's going to be our next step. When you're up on top of the load, be sure to position your end flap so that you can get a hold of it from down below. So if you leave it stretched out on top of the load, a lot of times it's really hard to reach. So if you remember to fold it over and get it close to the end of the load, then once you're down on the trailer, you can get a hold of it and pull it out. Now the fastening up of the rear tarp is going to be different on the end than what it is on the front. So on the rear, we can actually pull the end flap down and it's going to stay down for the rest of the duration. So now you can see I've deliberately positioned the tarp too far forward on the load so that I need to pull it back, but that gives me the opportunity to get the positioning of this end flap just right. One of the most common beginner mistakes is they either end up with the tarp too far up on the load or too far off the end. Too far off the end seems to be a more common mistake. So by starting with it too far on the load, it gives you the opportunity to pull it. It takes some strength to pull on this, and when you try to pull on D-rings with your fingers, it's going to hurt. If you've got some bungees, then you can hook into the D-rings and make things a lot easier for yourself. So I'm going to hook into a couple of D-rings here. And the technique is kind of important. So you want to get your bungee hooked in there, and you don't want to pull on the rubber. You want to get a hold of the hook so that creates a handle. I've got my thumb over the top of there so that hook doesn't come unhooked or the wire doesn't straighten out. Get hooked in with two so that you can pull comfortably. Keep in mind your footing and what's behind you so that you don't get into unsafe situation. And then you can lean back, and sometimes you have to kind of yank it a little bit, but we can get that whole tarp to slide back. And I'm looking for the seam at the top of the end flap. In a perfect world, you'd get that seam right at the top there. And then pay attention to your side-to-side centering as you're doing this. So my tarp is a little bit too far to the right. So as I'm pulling it back, I can influence it to go to the left a little bit and get it centered up. So the end flap here is going to end up being tucked underneath. Now this load is tall enough that we don't have a whole lot of extra fabric to deal with, but if you've got a lower load, it's actually handy to fold that tarp up on top of here so that when you flip it over the end, it's already tucked underneath. But we'll revisit that on a segment we do later on a lower load. It's really important anytime that you have vertical tarp at the back end of a load that you get downward fastening on that vertical tarp. If you don't, when you drive down the road, there's a low pressure area here at the back of the load that creates a suction, and it'll pull that tarp out of there, and then pretty soon you got a nice little flag waving at the people behind you. So even on a load like this where our side flaps are going to wrap in around this, we still need to fasten this down. Sometimes this is in the way, so a lot of times what I'll do is I'll just take a bungee and temporarily fasten this up here somewhere so that it's out of my way. Now I can see what I'm doing. And generally, you'll want to take your end flap and fold it up underneath and see if you can find a spot where on the rear, it might actually be able to come underneath the load. You won't be able to accomplish that on all loads, but we've got the other side done already. And you can kind of work your way back and forth, but you want to have downward and forward pressure on this lower part here. So I'm just going to go. Anytime you take a hold of one of these things, just assume it's going to come unhooked or snap on you. So now we can come back here and grab a D-ring, and we've got our rear flap where it's going to be pretty secure against the wind. Now I'll just turn this loose again and let it come down.